I've often been said in South Africa, who cares about the Americans because China will just take up the economic slack. Well, not so fast, because maybe they won't. In any case, before we get onto the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. It really will help me. In the long run, I'd really like to get to 200,000 subs. I'm quite away from it. And Ronaldo keeps making fun of me. So come on, man, help me out. Can't be outdone by Ronaldo, can we? And I guess let's actually get onto the main video. Let's actually start off first with what the United States, or Trump, is doing to South Africa. Well, the US has just sent out invitations to the first G20 meetings of its presidency, and every single G20 member got one, apart from South Africa. It's not a clerical error, because the Trump administration is making good on its promise to punish South Africa for three things. The first is the genocide case against Israel, which South Africa obviously launched. The second is the refusal to do a symbolic handover of the G20 at the Johannesburg summit, our G20, if you will. And the third one is, well, obviously the normal one around the farmers' murders. I can't say what that actually links to, you know why. And the human rights abuses against Afrikaners. Now, on paper, South Africa is still a G20 founding member. And DOFA has been very firm that says South Africa is a member in its own name and right, and the forum's legitimacy comes from its full current composition. So in other words, the forum itself won't be legitimate without South Africa. But I'm reminded that when the US wasn't in South Africa said, who cares? The US isn't there. We'll just get on without them. So you didn't have legitimacy when you didn't have the US. You might say, well, they boycotted it, but they weren't there regardless. But now you only get legitimacy if you include South Africa. It's a bit like a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum, isn't it? But in any case, you have to remind yourself, if you're not in the room when the agenda is set, you don't have any role in the agenda. And so that's the end of it. And South Africa isn't involved in setting the agenda because it's not invited. Now, analysts have pointed out that under the US presidency, none of the priorities Ramaphosa pushed during the Johannesburg summit are likely to be moved forward. So basically, we spent a lot of money on this thing for nothing. And we're going to get nothing from it. We're not even going to be able to push forward our priorities. Now, Washington has made it very clear that South Africa will not be invited to the 2026 G20's Leaders Summit in Miami. Now, Ramaphosa has been pretty clear. In a church newsletter, yeah, that's what we're resorting to now, he praised U.S. solidarity during apartheid and thanked Americans for inspiring our Bill of Rights, and says South Africa remains a firm and unwavering friend of the American people. So now we're resorting to praising the Americans. I mean, we've spent months calling them apartheid people and genociders and racists and, brutal white supremacists and whatever other rubbish. But that's not really gone the way they wanted. So now they're resorting to, saying pleasantries. Yep, the state of diplomacy in South Africa. Now, Germany's leadership says they're trying to convince Trump to invite South Africa. But Poland, very interestingly, is being granted a special invitee status by the US. So Poland looks like they're going to take our place. So on one hand, we have the Global South narrative, South Africa as a principled, non-aligned middle player, even though we are very much aligned, and we can talk about that in a minute. And Trump's just like, don't care, invite Poland. But what we really can tell from this is that Trump is using everything in his power to penalize countries that step out of line. South Africa is very much one of those. He's now using G20 access, he's used tariffs, and he's used aids. And well, the onslaught against South Africa probably isn't just going to stop here. It is going to have a real hard-hitting impact on the economy. Because, as I said, first it was tariffs. As you know, Trump slapped a 30% reciprocal tariff on South African exports broadly and then layered sector-specific measures on top. Now, vehicle exports to the US have now fallen by half since the 25% import duties kicked in. Now, steel is also in the firing line. US imports tariffs set at 50%, with Europe threatening to double its own duties to the same level. So we don't really have many individuals we can go to try alleviate the pressures of tariff. Now, at the same time, we've been crushed between China and Europe. Now, China's trade surplus to South Africa has blown out to 162 billion in 10 months. Now, a lot of people don't understand that because the answer we frequently get is, don't worry, we don't need the Americans. All we'll do is pivot to China. And I keep saying this, the retardation in South Africa is just unbearable because people don't understand something. You have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. What does that mean? Some economies want to sell you stuff. Some economies want to buy stuff. It's that simple. When you sell stuff to an economy, you make money. Money comes to you. When you buy stuff, your money goes to them. Obviously, you want people to buy your stuff so you get money and you become richer. Like, I can't explain this in a more simplistic way. That's not who China are. China sells stuff. They don't buy stuff. And so what we have now seen is that our trade deficit to China is a blowout. It's a blowout at 162 billion. It's ballooned in 10 months. In other words, we are buying things. We are not selling them things. So what exactly are we buying? Well, Chinese electronics, machinery, and cheap cars are all flooding South African markets. Now, what does that mean? Well, South Africa's local manufacturers like BMW openly talking about a crisis. So what is that crisis? Well, the crisis is it's no longer economically viable to make things in South Africa. Now, South African exports to China are down. They are not up. So this whole pivot to China isn't working out the way they thought it would. And essentially, ores and chrome are down because Chinese producers with half-price electricity undercut our own smelters so badly that they close. So they are actually not only actively selling us stuff, they're destroying our local manufacturing capacity. So what's actually keeping South Africa afloat? Well, it's Europe. Vehicles exported to the EU, especially Germany, have risen sharply. October saw 16 billion rand in vehicle exports to Europe, over half of that to Germany. Now, precious metals are our lifeline. That's basically the only thing we're able to export at the moment. We got gold exports to the US and EU are booming, helped by prices roughly 50% higher than a year ago, and those exports are exempt from Trump's tariffs. So yes, that's not very good for us in terms of our manufacturing capabilities. And this means that actually the mood on the ground for manufacturers is actually very gloomy. Now, the Manufacturing Purchase Managers Index dropped to 42 in November, the worst since the hard COVID lockdowns. Anything below 50 means a contraction. Now, new orders have collapsed, exports remain weak, and even local demand has faded after a brief revival in 2024. So to put simply, our factories are under pressure from tariffs abroad, cheap imports at homes, and collapsing confidence. Nobody wants to get anything made in South Africa. And the government is simultaneously picking a fight with the one superpower that still buys 60+% of our precious metals exports. Well, that's the US. And obviously we've just talked about that, and we've seen what the US is doing in retaliation. Now, as you know, the US has cut all aid funding to South Africa. Well, the place that's going to hurt South Africa the worst is obviously going to be in HIV, because the Americans have been funding our HIV programs for a very long time. Now, South Africa carries the world's heaviest HIV burden. Roughly 1 in 5 people live with HIV. And until this year, the US funded about 17% of our HIV budget. And as you know, Trump just cut it, the whole thing completely. Now, the results are expected to be that clinics are going to close and staff will be laid off. And a survey of roughly 200 community organizations finds that almost a quarter had to retrench staff within the last 2 months because of those cuts. Now, viral load testings in key groups dropped by up to 21%, which is risking silent treatment failure and resistance. So what does that mean? Well, individuals are going undiagnosed for HIV, which is meaning that they're likely to spread it more and not actually seek treatment from it. Now, NGOs are scrambling for creative fixes. We've had the social impact bonds that pay investors if HIV and teen pregnancy targets are met. There's kind of like a way to incentivize people to do something around it. We've had online training courses to somehow generate income, and from that income, they use it to fund all this creative HIV funding. But some think tanks are now suggesting a new sin tax on gambling, crypto, and other activities. Now, this is becoming important because in the last few days, we've seen a number of hit pieces in the media, also kind of sponsored by the government, around gambling. And they talk quite a lot around online gambling and how it's ruining South Africa and wah. And I have been wondering what the whole focus on that is. And now we have an idea. The idea is certainly going to be a sin tax on gambling and crypto and other speculative activities, as they say, with the idea of using that money to fund all this HIV treatment that we're no longer getting from the US. Do let me know what you think of that in the comments. So when we talk about Trump punishing South Africa, this isn't just about diplomatic slights. As you can see, it's tariffs, factory closures, and the HIV programs. Not just our, G20, you can't go there. Well, as we said, one of the key slights that the US keeps saying to South Africa is that you're not non-aligned. You're actually picking a side with our adversaries. And a good example of that is South Africa's approach to Russia. Now, as you know, Trump has been attempting to make a deal in Ukraine in order to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, the news is that Envoys has spent 5 hours with the Kremlin, and Putin has persisted on a revised US plan to end the 4-year war. Now, the problem with that plan, and the reason it's not being accepted, is, well, because it demands territory. So Putin's been very clear, he wants territory. You give him this territory, we end the war. Now, Putin demands that Ukraine surrender the regions Moscow claims it owns and rejects any European peacekeeping gestures. Now, Kiev says absolutely not. They said any peace must be permanent, not just a frozen conflict that lets Russia rearm. So Putin has been on TV and warns Europe, if you want a war with Russia, we're ready right now. And Europe's defeat would be so total that there would be no one left to negotiate with. Now, he accuses European states of sabotaging Trump's peace efforts by pushing proposals that they know Russia cannot accept. So, yeah, this is actually turning out to be a bit of a stalemate. Now, let's just be clear what's going on here. Putin says we conquered some land, it's ours. You give us that land, you agree that it's ours, we end the war. We withdraw our troops to our land, and Ukraine must remain neutral, can't join NATO, can't join Europe. We'll give you guarantees not to attack. And you can give them guarantees that if we do, you can do whatever you feel you need to do. And Europe said, no deal, we're not ceding any land. And Putin's like, it's not part of the negotiation. Now, it can't be a negotiation where one side just gets everything they want. And I'm reminded that this conflict could have been over in days within its starting had Boris Johnson not put his oar in it and said to Ukraine, don't worry, we'll back you. Because that's what's happening now. Europe is saying to Ukraine signaled that they would be willing to accept the peace deal, and then Europe said, nah, don't do that, we'll back you. So it does look like the conflict is just going to go on forever and ever and ever. So where does South Africa sit in all this? Well, as I said, on paper, we're non-aligned, but in practice, we use our UN voting record to abstain from any resolution criticizing Russia. This is in complete contrast to our voting record against Israel, where we constantly go after them. Now, this week, South Africa's record of abstentions is actually going to be stress tested. And you have to ask yourself why. Well, the UN General Assembly is voting on a resolution demanding Russia return over 20,000 Ukrainian children abducted during the war and back to Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian Association of South Africa says that South Africa has had enough of abstentions. Apparently, we cannot abstain on children's rights. Now, this is true because South Africa was very vocal around the rights of children in Palestine. So you can't say, here's our principle in Palestine, but we don't have the same principles when it comes through to Ukraine. Now, Ramaphosa has publicly committed to helping return the children to Ukraine. South Africa even hosted a conference on the issue and volunteered as a mediator alongside the Vatican and Qatar. But in the usual way, South Africa offers all these grand gestures, but never actually does anything. Now, activists are saying that they're seeing little tangible progress from Pretoria, the same as they had in Palestine, while Qatar has quietly managed to get at least some children home. So pretty much what Trump was able to do in that conflict that South Africa couldn't. So I mean, it's amazing how we constantly want to be the mediator that just never does anything. Now, it's pretty much a simple moral question. If you truly believe that children shouldn't be pawns in wars and you call yourself non-aligned on whether they should be sent back to their families, then you vote against Russia. But South Africa doesn't do that because they still consider Russia to be an ally. Now, this moral ambiguity is starting to even look sharper inside of South Africa because news has now come out that a senior SAFM broadcaster who also co-chairs the Association of BRICS Journalists has been arrested at OR Tambo accused of recruiting at least 7 South Africans to fight for Russia in Ukraine. Now, if you've watched my video around this, around the MK palaver with Zuma on that, well, then you kind of know what's going on. Well, this individual, this broadcaster, is now being tied to that whole event. Now, her arrest came after Turkish Airlines alerted the Hawks that 4 South African men tried to board a flight, saying that they were on their way to Russia to fight. Now, police then picked up 3 more men, 2 already under contract with the Russian military, and seized phones and backpacks as digital evidence. Now, all this sits in the shadows of everything that occurred with Duduzile Zuma, who helped recruit at least 17 South Africans now stuck on the Russian front. Now, claims she completely denies. She's in the WhatsApp groups encouraging people to go. So on one level, South Africa is abstaining on resolutions about returning Ukrainian children. They're going after the whole mess that's in Gaza. And then we're recruiting soldiers to fight the very state accused of abducting children and facing ICC warrants, while saying that we would abide by our own ICC warrants against Netanyahu. Like, you can't say that the South African state is non-aligned. They claim it is, but diplomatically, they're not. Diplomatically, they continue to be timid, and they continue to align with the very states that the US seems or considers to be hostile to the Western order. And to a degree, South Africa wants that because it is anti-Western. At least that's my opinions. Do let me know what you think in the comments section below. And until next time, bye.